tell them Lehman's a dead man walking. They're gone because no one will take their name in a trade. But more importantly, in 2008, the Federal Reserve calculated that a failure of Lehman Brothers would trigger about $400 billion in payments by the other Wall Street bank on the credit default swaps, which are a kind of insurance product they had written against a failure of Lehman Brothers. And the number struck me as odd because I knew they were just adding up all of these instruments on all the other banks' balance sheets. And the reason why I thought it was odd is I knew that every one of those banks were re-hedging that exposure every time they wrote that protection because they were re-hedging it on our platform. And I thought if they thought a failure of Lehman Brothers would trigger $400 billion, I thought the number was much lower. I was estimating about $200 billion. And I called a professor at Georgetown, at NYU named Bruce Tuckman. I said, Bruce, you've studied this. I've read some of your papers. What do you think? And he said, well, I think actually it would only trigger a payout of about $80 billion. Anyway, President Obama subsequently asked me to join the CFTC, and President Trump named me as chairman of the agency in 2017. I called Bruce Tuckman up and I said, how would you like to come here as chief economist? And how would you like to research that calculation we did? Anyway, he did, and he published a paper a few years later. A failure of Lehman Brothers would have not triggered $400 billion of payouts. It would have not triggered 200. It would not have triggered $80 billion of payout. We now know that a failure of Lehman Brothers would have triggered less than $8 billion of payments of the other Wall Street banks. If we knew in 2008 that was the case, we might not have had a panic, because the panic was one of opacity. Nobody knew what would happen if a Lehman Brothers fell. If we knew if we knew it was less than $8 billion, we could have let it been sold, we could have let it fail, we could have bailed it out. We would have had policy choices that we didn't have because we didn't know. Well, back in 2008, I also read another paper, not just the one by Bruce Tuckman. I read the one by Satoshi Nakamoto. And that proposed that if all the world's liabilities were on one balance sheet, one ledger, we would know if all those Lehman Brothers exposures, not just the ones that were written against them, but the ones that were then re-hedged, were on a single ledger, we would have perhaps not had a crisis because we would have known the truth. And that's when I fell down the crypto rabbit hole.
Is 10 years out on the financial crisis, we still don't have the infrastructure perhaps to prevent the next one. And I think this is where digital assets can really help, because an efficient digital asset can really solve some of the key problems in global liquidity. You know, the world's got trillions and trillions of dollars tied up in liquidity just to get around how clunky the movement of value is around the world. If with a really efficient digital asset, something like XRP, and that's what we believe will be the most efficient, you can now reduce trillions and trillions of capital from being tied up. So you can make those transfers instantly as a bank or as a payment provider or as an enterprise without having to have money pre-positioned all over the world.